Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. You know, there's something about winter nights that takes us back, isn't there? Back to those childhood evenings when the world seemed both smaller and infinitely larger at the same time. Maybe you remember sitting around a campfire, the flames dancing against the darkness, while someone told stories of the Old West, of pioneers and frontiersmen who faced winters we can barely imagine from the comfort of our heated homes. The smell of wood smoke, the crackle of burning pine, the way the cold pressed in from beyond the circle of light, making that warmth seem even more precious. Those stories felt thrilling, then safely distant like adventure without consequence. But tonight, I want to share something with you that those old storytellers might not have known, or perhaps chose not to tell. Tonight, we're going to explore not the romance of frontier winters, but their stark, beautiful physics. Before we begin, let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're standing in a forest where winter has arrived in earnest. The temperature has dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing. There's a wind moving through the bare branches, and the ground beneath your feet radiates cold like an open freezer. Now here's what most people don't understand about this moment. You're not standing at the beginning of a gradual decline into discomfort. You're standing at the edge of a biological cliff, and you have exactly 90 minutes before your body begins to fail you in ways you cannot reverse without help. Not 90 minutes until you feel cold. Not 90 minutes until you wish you were somewhere warmer. 90 minutes until your core temperature drops low enough that your fingers can no longer tie knots. Your mind can no longer make clear decisions, and your muscles can no longer build the shelter that might save your life. This isn't a metaphor. This is the cruel mathematics of heat loss, and it's a countdown that has claimed more lives than avalanches, wolves, and falls combined. I know what you might be thinking. You've seen the gear, haven't you? The $400 tents that promise to withstand Arctic conditions, the sleeping bags rated for temperatures that would make an iceberg shiver, the space-age emergency blankets that fold down smaller than a sandwich. Surely modern technology has solved this ancient problem. And that's where tonight's story takes an unexpected turn. Because I'm going to tell you something that the outdoor industry doesn't advertise on their glossy websites. In the real conditions of a winter forest with moisture in the air, with wind finding every gap with the earth below you, pulling heat from your body like a thief in the night, most of that expensive equipment fails. It fails quietly, insidiously, in ways you don't notice until it's too late. The zippers freeze, the insulation compresses, the waterproof membranes saturate, and you're left with nothing but the knowledge you carry in your mind and the skills you've practiced with your hands. So what does work? What kept human beings alive for 200,000 winters before there was such a thing as Gore-Tex or REI? The answer is so simple, so elegant that it sounds almost primitive until you understand the physics beneath it. A debris hut, a shelter built from nothing but dead leaves, dry branches and pine needles. A cocoon of forest matter piled 3 feet thick, creating a space barely larger than your body. Inside that humble structure, while the wind howls and the thermometer plunges, your body heat can raise the temperature from 20 degrees outside to 70 degrees inside, sustained by nothing more than the trapped air between millions of leaves. This isn't folklore. This isn't romantic primitivism. This is thermodynamics. This is the difference between being a survivor and becoming a statistic in a search and rescue report. Tonight, we're going to learn what those long-ago frontiersmen knew in their bones. We're going to understand why survival in the winter has never been about what you can buy, but about what you can comprehend. We'll build that shelter together step by step, and I'll show you the modifications that 99% of bushcraft videos never mention. But more than that, we're going to slow down. We're going to let the story of human resilience in the face of cold wash over us like a gentle stream. And maybe, just maybe, as we explore these quiet skills from our ancestors, you'll find that same peaceful feeling you had as a child, warm and safe while the winter wind sang its old songs outside. So settle in. Pull your blanket a little closer, and let's step together into a winter night where knowledge, not equipment, makes the difference between life and death. To understand why the debris hut works, we first need to understand what we're protecting ourselves against. And here's something beautiful in its simplicity. The cold isn't trying to get in. The cold isn't an invader. What's actually happening is that your warmth is trying to escape. You are, in the most literal sense, a small furnace. Your body, right now, as you rest, is producing about 100 watts of heat. That's the equivalent of an old incandescent light bulb, burning constantly fueled by the food you ate and the metabolism that keeps you alive. And like any source of heat, you're trying to equalize with the world around you. Heat always moves from warm to cold, never the other way, following one of the most fundamental laws of physics. Your body wants to give that warmth to the freezing air, to the frozen ground, to the cold wind passing by. It will do so through 3 distinct pathways, 3 quiet thieves that work together to steal your life if you let them. The first thief is called conduction. Imagine, if you will, reaching out and placing your hand on a block of ice. You feel the cold immediately, don't you? But what's really happening is that heat is flowing from your warm hand into the cold ice. The ice molecules, moving slowly in their frozen state, begin to move faster as they absorb your heat. Meanwhile, your skin cells lose energy, their molecules slowing down, and you register this loss as cold. Conduction is heat theft through direct contact. And in a winter forest, the greatest conductor, the most efficient thief of all, is the ground beneath you. Soil, rock, frozen earth, they have enormous thermal mass. Frozen earth can steal immense heat without warming up itself. Lie on it and you'll lose warmth 40 times faster than to the air alone. It draws your heat down like silent roots, which is why even the world's finest blanket won't save you from hypothermia if the ground beneath you is cold. The second thief is convection, the theft by moving air. Picture blowing on hot soup. You're not cooling your breath, but replacing warm air over the soup with cooler air, carrying heat away. The same happens when wind touches your skin. Every breeze strips away your body's warm layer, replacing it with air eager for more. That's why a drafty tent feels so cold. Fabric may block rain, but moving air inside steadily carries your warmth away, molecule by molecule, into the night. The third thief is the most insidious. Because you cannot see, it cannot feel it happening. Yet it accounts for more than half of your heat loss in certain conditions. This is radiation. Every object that has temperature, including your body, is constantly emitting infrared radiation light waves that our eyes cannot see, but that carry energy out into the universe. You are quite literally glowing. You're a small star radiating your warmth into the vast coldness of space. On a clear winter night under an open sky, this radiation streams upward from your skin, from your clothes, from your shelter if it's not properly insulated, traveling at the speed of light into the infinite black. It doesn't need wind. It doesn't need contact. It simply happens as surely as the sun radiates light in all directions. This is why clear nights are colder than cloudy ones. Clouds act like a blanket in the sky, absorbing and reflecting some of that radiated heat back down to Earth. Without them, without anything to stop it, your radiated warmth flies away irretrievable. The elegant truth of a proper debris hut is that it defeats all three thieves at once. A thick bed of leaves beneath you stops conduction from the ground. The small enclosed space filled with dead air stops convection from stealing your warmth. And 3 feet of organic matter in the walls stops radiation from escaping. Every leaf and needle contains pockets of trapped still air, nature's finest insulator. The hut doesn't create heat. It simply traps yours, allowing your body's own 100-watt furnace to warm the space from survivable to comfortable. This is survival architecture, simple, devastatingly effective, and refined through countless winters by human hands. Let me take you back, now, back beyond the pioneers, beyond the mountain men, beyond even the indigenous peoples of this continent. Let's go back to a time when the last ice age still gripped much of the northern hemisphere, when glaciers miles thick covered lands that would one day become cities, when human beings were just beginning to spread out of Africa into colder climates they had never experienced before. These early people had no synthetic fabrics, no metal tools, no accumulated wisdom passed down through books or videos. What they had was curiosity, observation, and the fundamental human trait of problem-solving under pressure. And somewhere in that deep past, perhaps, in 100 different places independently, someone made the crucial observation that changed everything. They noticed that when snow fell and covered the entrance to an animal's den, the animal inside was warmer than the air outside. They noticed that birds fluffing their feathers in winter were creating tiny air spaces that trapped heat. They noticed that leaves piled in the corner of a windbreak didn't blow away because they trapped each other, and beneath that pile the ground was softer, less frozen. And from these observations, they built the first debris shelters. The design that emerged is so fundamentally sound that it has remained virtually unchanged across cultures and millennia. From the forests of prehistoric Europe to the woodlands of North America, from the mountains of Asia to anywhere humans encountered cold winters with trees, the basic structure appears again and again. A ridgepole, a framework of ribs, a lattice to hold the insulation, and layer upon layer of dead plant matter. It's not called a debris hut because it's made of garbage or junk. It's called that because it's built from what the forest constantly sheds, the annual cycle of growth and decay that produces millions of tons of perfect insulation material every autumn. Leaves, pine needles, bark strips, dry grass, all of it free, all of it renewable, all of it containing those millions of tiny air pockets that make the whole structure work. What strikes me most about this design, what I find almost moving in its humanity, is that it represents a fundamental shift in how early people thought about their relationship with winter. They stopped trying to run from it, stopped trying to fight it with sheer endurance, and instead learned to work with the physics of their situation. They made themselves small. They created spaces barely larger than their bodies. They accepted that warmth wasn't something to be conquered or manufactured in great quantities, but something to be carefully hoarded, jealously guarded, respected as the precious resource it was. In a way, this shelter is the physical manifestation of humility, the acknowledgement that human beings are small and fragile in the face of winter's power, but that smallness properly managed could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The debris hut you can build today is the same shelter in principle that kept a Neanderthal family alive 30,000 years ago. The physics hasn't changed. The definition of hypothermia hasn't changed. What has changed is that we've allowed ourselves to forget to become dependent on things that can break or run out, to substitute money for knowledge and equipment for skill. And in that forgetting, in that dependence, we've made ourselves more vulnerable than our ancestors ever were. Because they knew in their bones, in their lived experience, that winter survival was never about what you own. It was about what you knew. It was about being able to look at a pile of dead leaves and see not waste, but salvation. It was about understanding that the forest, properly asked, would give you everything you needed to survive the longest night, the deepest cold, the most desperate circumstances. Before we even begin to gather our first stick, before we think about construction techniques or insulation thickness, we need to talk about something that will determine whether our shelter works beautifully or fails catastrophically, and that's location. The single biggest mistake that well-meaning but inexperienced people make when building a winter shelter is choosing a spot that seems protected but is actually a death trap. And the reason they make this mistake is that they don't understand how cold air behaves. They think of temperature as something that simply is, as if the entire forest is uniformly cold once the sun goes down. But temperature has topology. It has valleys and peaks, rivers and pools. Cold air is a fluid, and it flows according to rules as predictable as water flowing downhill. On a clear winter night, the ground radiates heat into space and cools. The air touching it also cools, becoming denser and heavier. This dense cold air then flows downhill like water, a process called cold air drainage. It pools in valleys and low areas, creating an invisible lake of frigid air. A valley floor can be 10 to 20 degrees colder than a slope just a few hundred feet above. Build your shelter there, and you're sleeping in a reservoir of the coldest air available. The ideal location, known for generations as the thermal belt, is on a slope. It's high enough to be above the valley's cold pool, yet low enough to be sheltered from the wind-whipped ridge. Here, the air is calmer, warmer, and more stable. You can spot it by hardier vegetation, faster melting snow, and animals bedding down instinctively. Wind is another critical factor. It doesn't just feel cold, it actively steals warmth through convection. Seek natural windbreaks, a dense stand of evergreens to shatter the wind, a large boulder to create a calm lee side, or even a fallen log positioned between you and the prevailing wind. Finally, avoid moisture. Ravines collect both cold air and water. Even without a visible stream, damp ground conducts heat away brutally. Choose slightly elevated, well-drained ground where the earth feels dry and springy underfoot, not wet and spongy. An old trapper's saying holds true. An hour choosing the right spot saves 10 hours of suffering in the wrong one. The land speaks. Learn to read its patterns, where the cold flows, where the wind breaks, where the ground stays dry, and you've won half the battle before gathering your first branch. Now we come to the building itself, the transformation of abstract knowledge into physical shelter. And I want you to understand something important before we begin. Building a debris hut properly with care and attention to detail takes time. 3 to 4 hours. If you're doing it right, longer, if you're learning. But we don't have that kind of time in our scenario, do we? We have 90 minutes before our fingers lose their dexterity, before our judgment becomes clouded, before we can no longer help ourselves. So what we're going to build is what I call a fast and dirty shelter. It won't be pretty. It won't be something you'd want to photograph for a survival manual, but it will keep you alive. It will give you a space where your body heat can accumulate rather than dissipate. And once you're inside, once you're warm and safe, you can spend tomorrow improving it, refining it, turning it into something more permanent. But tonight, speed and function trump aesthetics. Tonight, we're racing a biological clock. Step 1. The foundation of everything is the ridge pole. This is the spine of your shelter, the single structural element that everything else depends upon. You need a piece of dead wood, thick enough to support weight without breaking, long enough to cover your body when you lie down beside it. 8 to 10 feet is typical for most adults. Look for wood that's been dead for a season or two, long enough to have dried out, but not so long that it's begun to rot and weaken. Pine, fir, spruce. These conifers make excellent ridge poles because their straight growth pattern gives you a naturally straight piece to work with. One end of this pole needs to be elevated off the ground about 3 to 4 feet high, while the other end rests on the earth. The traditional method is to lash it to a standing tree or prop it in the fork of a low branch. But remember, we're working fast. If you can find a natural support, a rock outcrop or a fallen log that creates the right height, use it. Wedge your ridge pole in place. Test it with your weight to make sure it's stable and move on. Time is passing. The light is fading. Your body is losing heat. Step 2 is creating the ribbing, the skeleton that will hold your insulation. You're essentially building an elongated A-frame on both sides of your ridgepole. Gather dead branches the straightest you can find, anywhere from 4 to 8 feet long, depending on how much slope you want in your walls. The steeper the slope, the better snow and rain will shed off, but also the more material you'll need to fill in the frame. For our fast shelter, we're going for something like a 45-degree angle. Lean these ribs against your ridgepole, starting from the high end and working back, placing them close together, maybe 6 inches apart. Each pair of ribs on opposite sides of the ridgepole forms a triangular frame. As you add more ribs moving backwards, you're creating a series of these triangles, each one defining the shape of your shelter. The last ribs at the back end, where your feet will be, should come almost together, creating a closed point. The front, where your head will be, stays open for now. That's your entrance. Don't worry about lashing anything yet. In our emergency build, we're relying on gravity and the weight of the insulation to hold everything in place. Step 3 is the lattice, the layer that prevents your insulation from falling through the gaps between your ribs. Think of it as creating a basket weave pattern, using smaller sticks, twigs, pieces of bark, anything that will span the gaps and create a continuous surface. You're weaving these across your ribs, perpendicular to them, filling in the spaces. This doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be good enough to hold leaves. Where you have gaps, stuff them with bunches of grass or small branches with their twigs still attached. The goal here is to create a surface rough enough that debris piled on top will stay put rather than sliding down to the ground. This lattice work goes all around your shelter except for the entrance. It extends down to the ground on both sides, creating walls that will be thick with insulation, and it covers the back end completely. Your shelter is starting to take shape now. It's still just a skeleton, transparent, offering no real protection. But the bones are in place. Now comes the real work. Step 4 is the insulation itself, the debris that gives this shelter its name and its function. And this is where your understanding of physics directly translates into survival. Remember what we learned about trapped air being the key to insulation. Every leaf you pile on this frame creates more air pockets. The goal is a final thickness of 3 feet, measured from the lattice to the outer surface all the way around. 3 feet of leaves, needles, bark strips, dry grass, anything organic and dead that the forest provides. Start at the bottom and work your way up, letting each layer support the layers above it. Pile it on. Press it down gently to make sure it's not going to slide off. Then add more. You want the material to be loose enough that air is trapped between the pieces, but dense enough that wind won't blow it away. If you've chosen a good location in the thermal belt out of the main wind, this is easier. As you pile higher, the shelter begins to transform. It stops being a stick frame and becomes a mound, a small hill of forest debris with your entrance visible at one end. That entrance should be small, just large enough for you to crawl through. Remember, every square inch of opening is a place where your heat can escape. Small is warm, big is cold. Make it small. Now we come to the modifications, the refinements that separate a marginally functional shelter from one that will genuinely keep you comfortable through a long winter night. And the first of these, the most critical, the one that I see omitted from nearly every bushcraft video I've ever watched, is the floor. Listen carefully to this, because it could save your life. The ground beneath you will steal more of your body heat faster than the air around you ever could. Conduction through direct contact with the frozen earth is ruthlessly efficient. You can have walls 3 feet thick. You can have an entrance perfectly sealed. But if you're lying directly on cold ground, you will wake up hypothermic if you wake up at all. The solution is as simple as it is essential. Before you seal up your shelter, before you even finish piling debris on the walls, you need to create a floor inside a thick bed of insulating material that will break the conduction pathway between your body and the earth. Crawl inside your still unfinished shelter. Feel the ground beneath you. It's cold, isn't it? Hard, unforgiving, eager to drink in your warmth. Now start gathering more of that same debris you've been using on the walls. Leaves, pine needles, dry. Grass, small twigs. Anything that's dead and dry. Pile it inside the shelter from the back wall to the entrance, creating a mattress of organic matter. You're aiming for a depth of at least 12 inches before you lie down on it, because your body weight is going to compress it significantly. When you actually lie on this material, it might compress down to 4 or 6 inches, but that's enough. That's the barrier you need. As you're building this floor, pay attention to the feel of it. It should be soft, almost fluffy, with a lot of give when you press down. If it feels matted or dense, add more material on top. You want as much trapped air in that floor as possible. Think of it as building a mattress made of captured air pockets, each one a tiny insulator working in concert with millions of others. Some people suggest laying down larger pieces, first sticks, or small logs to create a platform that keeps you elevated off the ground. This can work, but it takes time we don't have in our 90-minute emergency build. The debris floor is faster, and it's what countless generations of humans have used successfully. Once you have this floor in place, once you've created that insulating barrier, you've taken care of the biggest single threat to your warmth. You've stopped the earth from pulling your heat away through conduction. Now you can finish the walls with confidence, knowing that you've addressed the hidden killer that claims so many people who should have survived. The second critical modification is the door plug. Your entrance, that opening you've left at one end of the shelter, is necessary for getting in and out, but it's also a massive thermal weak point. An open door in a heated house will let all the warm air escape in minutes. The same principle applies here, only the stakes are much higher. The solution is to prepare before you go inside for the night a large bundle of debris specifically sized to plug that entrance from the inside. Imagine it as a cork for a bottle, or better yet, as a movable wall that you can pull into place once you're situated. I like to use a big armful of pine boughs if they're available, because they're easy to handle as a unit and they provide excellent insulation. Alternatively, you can stuff a large leaf bag or even your jacket with debris to create a more manageable plug. The key is that this plug needs to be dense enough to stop airflow large enough to completely fill the entrance, and easy enough to move that you can position it from inside the shelter. Here's how it works in practice. You've finished building your walls to 3 feet thick all around. You've created your floor inside 12 inches of soft insulating material. You're satisfied that the structure is as good as it's going to get given your time constraints. Now you create your door plug and set it aside near the entrance. You crawl inside, pulling your plug in with you. You position yourself on your debris floor, usually lying on your side to minimize your profile in the small space. Then you reach forward and pull that door plug into the entrance, sealing yourself in. The moment you do this, the moment you close off that opening, everything changes. The dark becomes absolute. The wind sounds distant, muffled, and within minutes you begin to feel the temperature rising. Your breath, your body heat, the 100 watts of warmth you're constantly producing, it starts to accumulate in that small sealed space instead of escaping into the night. The air around you grows noticeably warmer. The debris beneath you, now insulated from the frozen ground, begins to take on some of your warmth rather than stealing it. You've created a micro-environment, a tiny pocket of survivable conditions in the midst of a landscape that would kill you in hours if you were exposed to it. One final note about the door plug, and this is important. You need to be able to remove it from the inside. You're not sealing yourself into a tomb. If you need to get out for any reason, to relieve yourself, to check on changing weather conditions, to escape if something goes wrong, you need that exit available. So when you position your plug, make sure you know exactly how to push it out. Practice it once or twice before you settle in for the night. The debris hut is a sanctuary, not a prison. It gives you options. It gives you time. It gives you warmth. But it should never make you feel trapped. I want to share something with you now that might surprise you, might even upset you if you've invested in expensive winter camping equipment. The modern outdoor industry. The companies that make all those high-tech fabrics and scientifically designed sleeping bags, they're very good at testing their products in controlled conditions. Laboratory testing, wind tunnels, environmental chambers where they can precisely control temperature and humidity and airflow. And in those perfect conditions, the equipment performs admirably. A sleeping bag rated for -20 degrees will indeed keep a test dummy warm at -20 degrees in a chamber with no wind and dry air. But the forest in winter is not a laboratory. It's a chaotic system of moisture and wind and ground cold. And in that real-world chaos, equipment that should work often doesn't. Let me tell you about a type of failure that's particularly insidious because it happens gradually. Synthetic insulation. The stuff in most modern sleeping bags and jackets works by trapping air in a maze of fibers. As long as those fibers stay dry and lofted, they insulate beautifully. But introduce moisture, whether from humidity in the air, from condensation of your own breath, or from direct precipitation, and those fibers begin to collapse. They clump together. The air spaces between them shrink or disappear entirely, and as the insulation compresses its ability to protect you, plummets. A sleeping bag that was rated for 20 below might, when damp, struggle to keep you warm at 30 above. This is called insulation failure, and it's killed people who thought they were prepared. Down insulation, the gold standard for weight-to-warmth ratio, is even more vulnerable to moisture. Wet down is not just useless, it's actively dangerous because it conducts heat away from your body. The feathers mat together into a soggy mass with no insulating properties whatsoever. And in a winter forest, with humidity from your breath condensing inside your shelter, with snow potentially melting on your clothes, with the air itself carrying moisture, keeping down dry, is a constant battle. You can buy expensive water-resistant down treated with special coatings, but even that has limits. Get it wet enough, and it fails. Tents present their own problems. A good four-season tent is designed to withstand high winds and heavy snow loads. But those same design features that make it strong also make it prone to condensation. The tent is essentially a sealed environment, and every breath you take adds moisture to the air inside. That moisture has to go somewhere, and on a cold night, it condenses on the inner surface of the tent fabric, dripping back down onto you and your gear. Some tents use double wall construction to manage this with an air gap between layers, but that only mitigates the problem. It doesn't eliminate it. And if your tent's ventilation system relies on mechanical vents or zippers, guess what happens when those freeze shut? You end up sealed in a moisture chamber, and all that expensive fabric becomes a liability. Modern gear makes a critical error. It replaces understanding with technology, asking for your faith in engineering over your own knowledge of physics. This creates a perilous dependency. When that gear inevitably fails in harsh conditions, you are left with nothing. No skills to build a natural shelter. No ability to manage moisture, having outsourced your survival to fragile, losable objects. Now consider the debris hut. Its reliability stems from physics, not material science. Leaves trap air damp or dry. If a layer compresses, add another. If wind strips a side pile on more debris. It is infinitely adjustable and repairable with surrounding materials. Its only failure is total collapse, which basic competence prevents. The knowledge to build it cannot be lost, depleted, or broken. It is profoundly a reliability that manufactured gear can never achieve. This isn't to say that modern equipment has no place. Of course it does. A good sleeping bag in dry conditions is far more convenient than a debris hut. But convenience and survival are not the same thing. When you're facing that 90-minute window, when you're in a situation where failure means death, you want to be relying on principles that have been tested, not in a laboratory, but in 200,000 years of human experience. You want to be carrying knowledge, not just equipment. Because knowledge weighs nothing, takes up no pack space, never runs out, and never ever fails. Let's talk now about that 90-minute window that I've mentioned several times but haven't fully explored. I want you to understand exactly what's happening to your body during this period, because understanding creates urgency, and urgency can save your life. When you first step into a 20-degree environment, wearing clothes that are inadequate for the conditions, your body immediately begins making adjustments. The first thing that happens is vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels in your extremities. Your body is intelligent. It knows that your core organs are what keep you alive, so it sacrifices your hands and feet, pulling warm blood away from them and keeping it circulating around your heart, lungs, and brain. This is why your fingers and toes go numb first. They're being deprived of blood flow. In the first 30 minutes, you'll still be able to function reasonably well, though you'll notice that your hands are getting stiff, harder to control. Fine motor skills start to degrade. Tying knots becomes difficult. Using a knife safely becomes challenging. If you need to build a fire, now is the time, because 15 minutes from now, you might not be able to strike a match. This is the window where you absolutely must have your shelter framework in place. Ridgepole up, ribs positioned lattice work started. If you haven't accomplished those tasks by the 30-minute mark, you're in serious trouble. Between 30 and 60 minutes, assuming you're working and generating some body heat through exertion, you enter a dangerous equilibrium. You're losing heat fast enough that your core temperature is dropping, but slowly enough that you can still think clearly and move with purpose. This is when you're piling debris onto your frame, working as quickly as you can while trying not to sweat, because sweat means moisture, and moisture means accelerated heat loss once you stop moving. Your body is burning through calories at an accelerated rate, trying to maintain temperature. If you haven't eaten recently, if your fuel reserves are low, the rate of temperature drop will be faster. Some people at this stage make the fatal mistake of thinking they're okay because they don't feel that cold. They're generating heat through work, and that feels like success. But the moment they stop working, the moment they try to rest, their temperature will plummet. Past the 60-minute mark, your body begins a quiet, dangerous betrayal. Your core temperature can drop to 95 degrees, tipping into mild hypothermia. Your thoughts blur your hands, fumble, and a deceptive apathy whispers that it's time to rest, not to finish the shelter that would save you. This is the cold hijacking your mind, stealing your urgency at the very moment you need it most. It is why some are found still mere minutes from safety, having simply decided to stop. Here's the brutal math I mentioned earlier. A proper debris hut takes 3 to 4 hours to build when you're working carefully, doing everything right, making it strong and well insulated. In an emergency, you have 90 minutes before your body starts betraying you. That means you can't build a perfect shelter. You have to build a fast shelter, a dirty shelter, a barely adequate shelter. You get the frame up as fast as possible. You throw on insulation by the armload rather than placing it carefully. You create a floor that's good enough rather than perfect. You make a door plug that will work rather than one that will last all winter. You get inside, you seal yourself in, and then you use your body heat over the next hour or two to warm up the space while you're still capable of surviving. Once you're warm, once you're safe tomorrow, you can improve everything. Tomorrow, you can make it beautiful. But tonight, speed is everything. Tonight, good enough is the difference between life and death. And understanding this, really internalizing it, is what separates people who survive from people who become cautionary tales. There's something particularly tragic about a person dying from exposure when they had the knowledge to save themselves. It happens more often than you'd think, and it happens because knowing how to build a shelter is not the same as building it correctly under pressure. So let me share with you the 5 most common mistakes, the 5 ways that people who should have survived ended up not making it through the night. These aren't hypothetical. These are patterns that search and rescue teams see repeatedly. And if learning about these mistakes means you never make them yourself, then this conversation will have been worth having. Mistake number 1 is building the shelter too large. This seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? More space means more comfort, more room to move around. But remember what we learned about heat. Your body produces about 100 watts of thermal energy. That's enough to warm a very small space to a comfortable temperature but it's nowhere near enough to heat a large space. A shelter that's 6 feet wide instead of 3 feet wide contains more than twice the air volume, and all that additional air needs to be warmed by your limited heat output. The result is a shelter that never gets warm enough. You spend the whole night shivering in a space that seemed generous and comfortable when you built it, but turned out to be a liability when physics had its say. The correct size for a one-person debris hut is claustrophobically small. You should be able to touch both walls with your elbows when you're lying on your side. There should be barely 6 inches of clearance above you when you're lying down. This feels wrong to our modern sensibilities, but it's right from a survival perspective. Small is warm, big is cold. Build small. Mistake number 2 is inadequate insulation thickness. People look at their shelter with 12 inches of debris piled on and think it looks substantial, well insulated, ready for the night. And 12 inches is better than nothing, but it's not enough. The rule of thumb is 3 feet measured from your latticework to the outer surface. That's 36 inches of leaves, needles, and forest debris. It seems like an absurd amount when you're building it. It seems like overkill. It's not. At 20 degrees outside, you need every inch of that insulation to slow down the heat transfer enough that your body can keep up. 30 inches might give you marginal warmth. 36 gives you comfort. Some people argue for even more in extreme cold, and they're not wrong. But 3 feet is the minimum for survival conditions. If you've built your shelter and the debris isn't so thick that you can't see the stick framework underneath, you haven't built enough. Keep piling. Mistake number 3 is forgetting the floor, which we've already discussed. But it's worth mentioning again because it's so commonly overlooked. People focus all their attention on the walls and roof, creating thick insulation above and around them, and then they lie down on bare ground and wonder why they can't get warm. The ground is a thermal mass that will drink your heat endlessly. It doesn't matter how good your walls are if you're lying on an efficient conductor. 6 to 8 inches of compressible debris under your body, creating a barrier between you and the earth, is not optional. It's absolutely essential. If you only have time and energy to do one thing, well, do the floor well. Mistake number 4 is poor site selection, which we covered earlier, but bears repeating here in the context of fatal errors. Building your shelter in a valley bottom because it seems protected from wind means building it in a pool of the coldest air available. Building near water because you want access to hydration means building in the dampest spot available. Building under a dead tree because it provides overhead cover means building under something that might fall on you if wind picks up. Building in an area where water might collect if it rains means spending the night in a puddle. All of these seem like small considerations when you're focused on construction, but they're the difference between a shelter that protects you and a shelter that puts you at even greater risk. Take the time to choose wisely. An hour of walking to find the right spot is time well spent. Mistake number 5 is the orientation of the entrance relative to prevailing wind. If you build your shelter with the opening facing into the wind, even if you have a door plug, you're going to have problems. Wind will find its way in. It will create a pressure difference that pushes cold air through any gaps in your insulation. The entrance should face away from the wind, ideally at a right angle to it, so that even if some air does move past your door plug, It's not being actively forced in by wind pressure. This seems obvious once you think about it, but when you're rushing to build in failing light with numb fingers, it's easy to forget to check wind direction. And spending the night in a shelter that would have been warm if only it had been facing the other direction is a mistake you'll only make once assuming you survive to learn from it. These 5 mistakes, avoidable with knowledge and attention, account for a significant percentage of debris hut failures. The shelter itself is sound. The physics works. But the implementation has to be right. And being aware of these pitfalls means you can check for them as you build. Is my shelter small enough? Check. Is my insulation 3 feet thick all around? Check. Did I create a floor? Check. Did I choose a good location? Check. Is my entrance facing away from the wind? Check. 5 simple questions that could save your life. I want to step back now from the immediate practical details and reflect for a moment on where this knowledge comes from, on the long human tradition of winter survival that we're tapping into when we build a debris hut. The Americas, before European contact, were home to millions of people living in climates that ranged from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. In the northern forests and plains, indigenous peoples faced winters that could be breathtakingly harsh months of deep cold with limited daylight and scarce food resources. And yet, they thrived. They didn't merely survive these winters. They created rich cultures, complex societies, spiritual traditions and knowledge systems that sustained them for thousands of years. How did they do it? The answer is that they understood winter intimately. It wasn't an enemy to be conquered or a hardship to be endured with gritted teeth. It was a season with its own logic, its own gifts, its own requirements. They knew which trees provided the best firewood and which provided the best materials for shelter. They knew how to read snow to understand what animals had passed through recently. They knew how to create clothing from animal hides that was far more effective than most modern winter gear because it managed moisture while retaining warmth. They knew how to build structures that worked with physics rather than against it. The long houses of the Haudenosaunee, for example, were massive communal dwellings that could house multiple families through the winter. The construction was sophisticated, using a frame of bent saplings covered with layers of elm bark. Inside, platforms at different heights took advantage of the fact that warm air rises with sleeping areas elevated where it was warmest. Central fires provided heat, and smoke holes that could be adjusted with bark flaps allowed for ventilation without excessive heat loss. This is climate control through observation and experimentation, through generations of refinement, through knowledge passed from elder to child in an unbroken chain. Smaller structures used by hunting parties or individuals caught away from the main village were remarkably similar to the debris hut we've been discussing. The principles were identical because the physics was identical. Create a small space. Insulate it heavily with whatever materials the forest provides. Minimize openings. Protect against ground cold. These weren't random choices or lucky guesses. They were the result of countless winters of experimentation, of people figuring out what worked and what didn't, what kept you alive and what got you killed. Every successful shelter design was bought with the lives of people who tried things that didn't work. Every technique we rely on today represents hard-won wisdom. And it wasn't just about physical shelter. Indigenous peoples understood that winter survival was also about mental preparation, about community support, about having stories and songs and rituals that gave meaning to the dark months. They knew that a person alone in the cold could lose hope, could make fatal mistakes because they stopped believing in the possibility of morning. So they created cultures of resilience, of shared responsibility, of collective knowledge. An elder who couldn't hunt anymore still had value because they carried knowledge. A child who wasn't yet strong enough to build a shelter still needed to learn the principles because one day their life might depend on it. When European settlers arrived, many of them died in their first winters, despite having what they considered superior technology. They had metal tools, woven cloth firearms, but they didn't have knowledge of the land, of the specific challenges of a North American winter, of how to live in this place. The ones who survived were often the ones who learned from indigenous people, who set aside their assumptions about civilization and savagery and paid attention to what actually worked. The Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony would have died without the help of the Wampanoag people showing them how to fish, how to cultivate corn, how to survive in a landscape they didn't understand. This is a pattern that repeated itself across the continent. The knowledge that saved lives wasn't European or American or indigenous. It was simply human knowledge about how to survive in specific conditions. When we build a debris hut today, we're not engaging in some sort of primitive recreation. We're tapping into that lineage of knowledge, that chain of human experience that stretches back to the first person who figured out that piling leaves over a stick frame would keep them warm enough to see sunrise. We're acknowledging that our ancestors, regardless of what continent they came from, were people who solved the same problems we face, who figured out how to turn the resources available into the tools needed. And in acknowledging that, in learning those skills, we're also becoming part of that tradition, adding our own experience to the collective understanding. Because the physics hasn't changed, the human need for warmth hasn't changed, and the forest's willingness to provide materials hasn't changed. What has changed is that we've allowed ourselves to forget to become dependent on a supply chain and a technology base that, however impressive, is ultimately fragile. Learning these old skills isn't about rejecting modernity. It's about ensuring that we have options, that we're not completely helpless if the systems we depend on fail. You know, I've spent my life studying these stories, these moments when human beings faced the edge of what's survivable and either found a way through or didn't. And what strikes me most after all these years isn't the dramatic rescues or the heroic endurance, though those have their place. What moves me is the quiet competence, the people who simply knew what to do because someone had taught them and they had practiced. And when the moment came, they didn't panic. They built their shelter. They made it through the night. They walked out the next morning and went on with their lives. There's a particular kind of courage in that, I think. Not the courage that charges into danger, but the courage that prepares carefully and then trusts in that preparation. The courage to make yourself small and humble. In the face of nature's power, to accept your limitations while working within them skillfully. We live in a time that celebrates individualism, self-reliance, the idea that we should be able to conquer any challenge through sheer force of will. But the old survival wisdom teaches something different. It teaches that we survive by adapting, by learning from those who came before, by acknowledging that the universe operates according to laws we didn't create and can't change. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. I sometimes wonder what our ancestors would think if they could see us now with our temperature-controlled homes and our overnight delivery of whatever gear we want. Would they be amazed at the comfort we've achieved? Certainly. Would they also be concerned about what we've lost in the process? Perhaps. Because they knew something that we're in danger of forgetting. That the skills and knowledge that keep you alive are worth more than any possession. And that the confidence that comes from genuine competence is deeper and more sustaining than the temporary sense of security that comes from owning the right equipment. I teach these skills not because I think everyone needs to go live in the woods, but because I believe that understanding our own capability, knowing that we could survive if we had to, changes something fundamental about how we move through the world. It makes us less fearful, more grounded, more connected to the long human story of adaptation and survival. And in an age where so much feels uncertain, where systems we thought were permanent prove fragile, that kind of knowledge feels more valuable than ever. So, take what we've talked about tonight, these principles of shelter and warmth and working with nature's physics, and let them settle into your understanding. Practice them if you can, even if just in your backyard on a mild spring evening. Because knowledge that stays theoretical is only half learned, but knowledge that lives in your hands, that you've tested and refined through experience, that becomes part of who you are, and that, more than any gear you could buy, will see you through whatever winters lie ahead. Let me share something personal with you, now a memory from my own life that shaped how I think about winter survival. This was decades ago when I was young enough that discomfort felt like adventure, and I didn't yet fully understand how thin the line between adventure and disaster really is. I had spent the day hiking in the mountains alone, enjoying the late autumn weather. The plan was to be back at my car before dark, but I had misjudged the distances, had stopped too often to look at interesting rock formations or follow deer trails. The sun dropped behind the mountains faster than I expected, and suddenly I was 3 hours from my car in deepening twilight with the temperature falling fast. I had some gear with me, a light sleeping bag that was adequate for autumn nights, a tarp, some food, a lighter. By the logic of modern camping, I should have been fine. Set up my tarp, get in my bag, wait for morning. But there was a wind picking up coming down from the peaks, and I knew from experience that wind would make that sleeping bag nearly useless. The tarp would flap and make noise all night, might even blow away if I didn't weigh it down properly, and I could already feel my hands starting to stiffen with cold. I had maybe an hour, 90 minutes at most, before I'd be too cold and clumsy to do anything useful. So I made a choice. I put away the tarp and the sleeping bag, and I built a debris hut. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't something I'd have wanted anyone else to see. The ridgepole was crooked. The framework looked like it had been assembled by someone with no depth perception, and I'm sure the insulation was thinner in some places than others. But I built it in about an hour and a half, working steadily, trying to remember everything I'd read and practiced. The bed I made inside was mostly pine needles, which are excellent insulation, but somewhat scratchy. The door plug, was just my jacket stuffed full of leaves and wedged into the entrance. And when I crawled inside, pulled that plug into place, and lay down on my makeshift mattress, the silence was absolute. The wind, which had been a constant roar, became a distant whisper. The cold, which had been seeping into my bones, stopped its advance. And within maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20, I started to feel genuinely warm. Not just less cold, but warm. The air around me, warmed by my body, had nowhere to escape to. It was accumulating in that small space, and the temperature was climbing. I slept that night, not well perhaps, but adequately. I woke several times disoriented in the absolute darkness, confused about where I was. But I was warm. My bag and tarp abandoned outside collected frost. The temperature dropped into the low 20s by the best estimate I could make later, and I, inside my pile of leaves and sticks, was comfortable enough that I could sleep. In the morning, I crawled out stiff and unglamorous, but alive and functional. I packed my gear, looked back at the lumpy pile of debris that had saved me from a miserable night at best, and hiked out. That experience taught me something that I don't think I could have learned any other way. It taught me that the knowledge, the understanding of why a shelter works and how to build one is more valuable than any piece of equipment I could carry. The equipment had weight, took up pack space, could be lost or damaged. The knowledge weighed nothing and could never be left behind. That night in the forest, if I had tried to rely on my sleeping bag and tarp, I would have been utterly miserable, perhaps dangerously cold. But because I knew how to build a debris hut, because I understood the physics of heat transfer and insulation, I was able to create safety from materials that were lying on the ground all around me, free for the taking, unlimited in quantity. You may wonder why I share this now as we slow our pace. Here is the truth I want you to feel deeply. Survival skills are not a theory or a story. They are insurance you carry within you, weightless and invisible, until the moment you need them most. That moment comes without warning, without caring if you are ready. It finds the hiker injured at dusk, the hunter turned around in the woods, the driver stranded on a lonely road. These things happen every year to people who never thought it could be them. But there is something more. When you learn to build shelter from the forest itself, when you see the land not just as scenery, but as a source of life, you touch an ancient part of what it means to be human. Your hands remember what your ancestors knew. You discover a quiet truth. Your survival does not depend on the world working perfectly. This brings a humble confidence. It is not arrogance. It is the wisdom of knowing your own smallness in the face of nature, and the intelligence to work with its laws, not against them. Now, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself inside that shelter. Feel the soft mattress of leaves beneath you, shielding you from the cold earth. Feel the walls of debris around you, close and insulating. Feel your own body warmth filling the tiny space, growing steadier with each breath. Hear the wind outside now, a distant whisper, part of the night's gentle song. And know you are safe. You hold the knowledge to create this safety wherever there are trees, leaves, and a little time. Carry that knowledge with you into sleep into your dreams, into tomorrow. It is yours. Nothing can ever take it away. We've traveled a long road tonight, you and I. We've explored the physics of heat and the biology of hypothermia. We've learned the architecture of survival, the step-by-step process of transforming forest debris into life-saving shelter. We've considered the ways that modern equipment can fail and the ways that ancient knowledge remains reliable. We've honored the indigenous peoples who refined these techniques over millennia. And we've shared stories yours in your imagination, and mine from my memory of nights when the cold pressed close, and understanding made the difference. I hope you're feeling relaxed now, settled deep into your blankets, warm and safe in your modern shelter, with its walls and roof and reliable heating. There's a beautiful irony in that, isn't there? We've spent this time talking about extreme cold and desperate survival, and all the while, you've been perfectly comfortable. But that comfort isn't meaningless. In fact, it's part of the point. You can appreciate warmth more fully when you understand cold. You can be grateful for safety when you understand danger. And you can rest more peacefully when you know that if circumstances ever demanded it, if you ever found yourself in that forest with the temperature dropping and night approaching, you would know what to do. You would build your shelter small and tight and thick with insulation. You would create your floor your protection against the cold ground. You would fashion your door plug and seal yourself inside, and you would survive. That knowledge is a gift passed down through countless generations, refined by experience tested in the harshest conditions Earth can provide. It's yours now to keep. No one can take it from you. It doesn't expire or wear out. It's simply there waiting, a tool in your mental toolkit that you might never need but will always have. As you close your eyes, now let your breathing slow. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the air moving in and out each breath, a small surrender to sleep. Let your muscles relax, starting with your face, your jaw unclenching, your forehead smoothing. Feel that relaxation spreading down through your neck, your shoulders, your arms. Your body is heavy, sinking into the mattress, supported and safe. The tensions of the day are draining away like water, finding low ground, leaving you lighter, calmer, ready for rest. Outside, perhaps the wind is blowing. Perhaps snow is falling, those tiny crystals forming in the clouds and tumbling down through darkness to cover the earth. Perhaps it's a clear night, and the stars are shining with that particular brilliance that only comes in cold weather. Whatever the night is doing, you're separate from it, protected by walls, and warmth held safe in this moment of transition between waking and sleeping. And as you drift deeper, I want you to know that the forest is sleeping too. The trees stand quiet, their sap slowed by cold, their life processes reduced to a barely perceptible maintenance. The animals are in their dens and burrows curled against the cold, trusting in the shelter they've created. Even the earth itself seems to sleep under winter's blanket, resting, conserving, waiting for the return of spring. You're part of that cycle, part of that ancient rhythm. Sleep and wake, cold and warm, dark and light, survival and renewal. Your ancestors knew these rhythms intimately. They lived inside them, marking time by seasons and weather patterns rather than clocks and calendars. And some part of you, some deep part that remembers what it was like to live, that close to the edge of possibility, recognizes the comfort and the wisdom in that way of being. You don't need to return to those times. You live in an age of remarkable comfort and security, but knowing that you could survive if you had to. Understanding the principles that make survival possible, that knowledge connects you backward through time to every human being who ever looked at a winter forest and figured out how to make it through the night. So rest now. Let sleep come naturally, easily, like leaves settling to the forest floor after they've blown as far as the wind can carry them. You're safe. You're warm. You're exactly where you need to be. And tomorrow, when you wake, the sun will rise on a world that continues to turn, that continues to offer both challenges and solutions, both cold and warmth, both danger and the knowledge to navigate through danger to safety. The stories of winter survival will still be there, waiting in the history books and in the memories of those who lived them. The physics of heat transfer will still be true, governed by laws as old as the universe. And you will still carry within you the understanding we've explored tonight, quiet and patient, ready if you ever need it. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep deeply and peacefully. The winter may be harsh, but you know its secrets now. You know how to read the land, how to build the shelter, how to work with the cold rather than against it. You know that survival is not about what you can buy, but about what you can understand. And that understanding, like all true understanding, brings with it a deep and lasting peace. Good night.